quite a few times as we were doing the brain, and I kept saying in our next unit we'll get to autonomic nervous system. In our next unit, well, now we're here. So, not a test, but the first time, when you remember the first time I mentioned autonomic nervous system, and there's so much in your brain already, I know, to try to go back. Day one, when we were doing an overview of the nervous system, we broke it down into the nervous system by location. And we said we had central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and peripheral nervous system, cranial nerves, and spinal nerves. And then we broke it down by function. And said we had sensory, and we have motor function. All right? And then we broke it down again by function and motor to voluntary motor or somatic, and involuntary motor or autonomic. Okay? I don't know if you remember that far back. They kind of all merged together. Some, I remember when I was taking classes as a graduate student and then teaching at the medical school, the medical students kept getting confused about the autonomic nervous system. And they wanted to include sensory and motor. Autonomic nervous system is a motor system. Right? The neurons of the autonomic motor system would be classified into what modality?
What'd you just say?
The neurons would be classified as to what modality? General, exactly. General, visceral, efferent. So our somatic, just a little bit of review here. Somatic efferent, all right, remember we call those neurons general, somatic efferent. And then this pathway, we started in the brain with, this is review, comparison. We started in the brain in the precentral gyrus. With our cell body. And it descended, crossed over in the medulla, descended the spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, we had the lower motor neuron. So this is upper motor neuron. Remember cortical spinal pathway? You thought you were done with it. You really are. Reminding you what you wanted to forget. And the lower motor neuron. So what did we, is this a ganglion or a nucleus?
Nucleus.
A nucleus. And where is that nucleus found?
Posterior.
Forming? Posterior. Anterior gray horn. So it's this forms the anterior gray horn. All right. The neurotransmitter released from our lower motor neuron is acetylcholine. Remember in our list of neurotransmitters that we talked about, acetylcholine was in its own group. And it's going to bind to skeletal muscle cells. Try to do that one away. Our upper motor neuron doesn't decide to just fire all by itself. I don't just randomly reach out and grab things. Okay? Or decide to just walk out of the classroom or say random words in an order that makes, well, should make sense to you after you study. So I have some mechanism of controlling my upper motor neuron. So what was one of the areas? Well, first of all, what lobe is going to control upper motor frontal, all right? And we talked about the prefrontal cortex and premotor areas. So short association neurons from those prefrontal cortex, premotor, depending on how much thought process is involved, is going to send a neuron, if I think about what I want to say, or I decide I want to reach up and touch the ceiling, I send that message to activate the upper motor neurons. And then that triggers the components of that pathway. So that's what we've dealt with so far. Okay? Now we're going to compare this pathway, this component, to our autonomic motor. And in fact, I'm going to turn the lights off and pull the screen up so I can leave that diagram on the board while we compare. So when we look at our visceral, our autonomic pathway, our neurons are identified as still efferent because they're still motor, right? Now if I cut the femoral nerve to my thigh, I'm cutting motor fibers. I'm also cutting sensory fibers. So they are found traveling in those spinal nerves together. And so traveling with our autonomic fibers, we may also find sensory fibers from the heart or from the stomach or from the bladder. But they're not part of the motor pathway. All right? The motor pathway is a motor pathway. The neurons are only motor. So these are described as general or identified as general, visceral, efferent. Interestingly enough, and I think it has to do because we cannot define clearly in gross sections of the brain or the brain stem a defined, remember the medial lemniscus pathway, the cortical spinal tract, you can actually follow that through gross sections of the spinal cord that can be stained and looked at in the microscope, and you can identify those locations and pathways. Those diagrams that I put up on the board on Tuesday, and it said dopaminergic pathways, or adrenergic pathways, or GABA pathways. They had arrows going to the nucleus accumbens and to the frontal cortex. Those are not structures that we can find in the brain and say, this is a discrete pathway. We just know that neurons move through that. They're not huge bundles that we can see discretely. We just know that there are neurons connecting between those groups. And so for the autonomic nervous system, we don't have, sorry, make it brighter, we don't have a discrete connection of something that we can say is the upper motor neuron. So what I'm going to be describing today and tomorrow is the lower motor neuron equivalent. It's two neurons, but they are both considered to be the lower motor neuron equivalent. Okay? So we can imply certain components that control, not even that form the upper motor neuron pathway. For instance, cranial nerve 3, ocular motor nerve, is going to send neurons to the ciliary muscle. We talked about that reflex. So if you were to shine a flashlight in my eye, the response, the signal going through the autonomic motor neuron is to cause that ciliary muscle or the sphincter muscle of my iris to constrict. What would be the neuron telling that to do that? It's not coming from my premotor cortex or my precentral gyrus, but we have to signal that neuron going to my pupillary muscle to constrict. It's coming from the sensory pathway of the light. So as the light comes into the eye and goes to the thalamus, it's sending another sensory neuron to the ocular motor neuron, and that is what's telling the ocular motor neuron to fire and cause my pupil to constrict. So there is no specific, there's nothing in the precentral gyrus. I can't do that on purpose. All right? So the source of control for our autonomic neurons is very vague, and a lot of textbooks don't even touch on it. So I'm not going to completely explain it. There are a variety of controls. Some of them are emotional. All right, so tears. The facial nerve does the lacrimal gland. It's constantly being stimulated to make tears to keep your eyes moist. And yet when we get emotional, those tears increase. All right? Our throat tightens up as vagus muscles in the pharynx and the esophagus constrict as well. And so from the emotional system of the brain, from the limbic system, those are going to send fibers. So it's a more diverse and diffuse pathway. So we don't have discrete pathways, but I don't want you to assume that these neurons that I'm going to be describing as the parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons are the only part of that autonomic nervous system. We just don't understand the direct pathways and how they overlap to get to those sites. So there's always something coming to cause that to happen, okay? Even if I don't describe it completely. So general ventral efferent, I'm going to, has its lower motor neuron cell bodies in the brain stem. And in regions of the spinal cord. Right? So let's just look at parasympathetic for now, because that's what we're covering today. So we would have the parasympathetic fibers. We've been talking about ocular motor. So ocular motor would have a cell body in the midbrain, and it is going to send a neuron out of the midbrain to a ganglia just outside the cell body, just outside the eyeball, and then this is going to go into the eyeball. So this is all a peripheral nerve. Cell body in the brainstem, in the ocular motor nuclei. Instead of one lower motor neuron, however, we have two. Okay? So this would be called the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. And this is the postganglionic neuron. Both of them are going to be releasing neurotransmitters for synapses. And this is going to synapse, in this case, on smooth muscle of the iris. So this is what most textbooks limit their description of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems to. And because it's two neurons, a lot of students, understandably, see this as the equivalent of the upper and lower motor neuron of our voluntary pathway. And it's not. These two neurons are the equivalent of a single lower motor neuron. They will be activated, and I'm going to do this with a dotted line because we don't know all the time where this is coming from. So structures that control autonomic nervous system, hypothalamus. That was one of its 10 or 12 major functions, is regulates autonomic nervous system. So nerve fibers from the hypothalamic nuclei are going to go to cranial nerve nuclei and spinal cord nuclei that have preganglionic fibers. Limbic system. Reticular activating, or just the reticular formation. That locus ceruleus we talked about with norepinephrine. So there's a great variety, and I think that's why a lot of textbooks just kind of don't even talk about it, because it is so vague. And there's not a specific tract. There are definitely neurons, but there's not enough of them to call a tract.
What are those four things?
These are what would be the upper motor neurons. Okay? We would have a prefrontal cortex because this is not voluntary control. So remember we talked about the tectal spinal pathway? And the upper motor neuron had its cell body in the superior colliculus. Or the rubrospinal pathway, the upper motor neuron was in the rubrospinal pathway. So it was unconscious control of skeletal muscle without voluntarily deciding you were going to do something. So think of it in that fashion. The upper motor neuron, not coming from voluntary control centers of the frontal cortex, would have their cell bodies in other areas of the brain and brainstem. It might be coming from the sensory ganglia for vision, or the thalamus where sensory stimuli are processed. And it's just, probably diffuse is the best term and why I drew the dotted line. Because there are neurons coming from different locations, but not enough of them to create a structural that can be obviously identified. Certainly the effects are there, and if you damage one of these areas, you would see a lack of activation of these neurons. Yes?
So do they know if it's just one?
It's more than one,
I mean,
but it's, and
so the upper
then,
motor neuron equivalent could be.
and also by diffuse, the limbic system can affect the hypothalamus. So, but it can also send in its own neurons to this area. So it's almost like the basal nuclei, where that's actually better understood, where we have incoming neurons from the substantia nigra, and then they send to globus pallidus, and we don't see those actual connections. They've just been figured out by testing specific areas of gray matter and inhibiting them. But we can't actually see bands of specific fibers that can be given an identification. So I put this up there because I want you to recognize that even though this is a 2-neuron system, it's not an upper and lower motor aspect. It's entirely lower, and our concepts of how we activate this are, we know it's there, but it's not been well marked. Okay? Now let's compare some of these neurons between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And today, after we do a comparison, we're going to look particularly at the parasympathetic.